Most people have seen the photographs. The tall guardsman standing rigid outside Buckingham Palace, the enormous black bearskin cap catching the midday sun, the polished boots reflecting the faces of 100 tourists jostling for position with their cameras raised. Most people have stood behind that rope line and watched those men stare straight ahead with an expression that suggests they have either achieved total inner peace or genuinely forgotten that the rest of the world exists. Most people think they understand the King's Guard. Most people have only ever seen the half of it. What the tourist photographs never capture, what the travel blogs never mention, and what even most Londoners go their entire lives without knowing, is that when the last sightseeing bus pulls away and the souvenir stalls fold up for the evening and the great iron gates of Windsor Castle close to the public, an entirely different operation begins. The lights along the public walkways dim. The ceremonial rhythm of the daytime gives way to something older, quieter, and considerably more serious. The night patrol takes over. And the night patrol is not what you think. There are no tourists on the long walk after 10 o'clock at night. There are no camera flashes, no children dressed in miniature bearskin caps, no cheerful voices calling out to see if they can make the guard smile. What there is 4,800 acres of darkness, broken by pools of amber light at intervals that a man on foot covers in a specific number of steps counted and memorized long before he ever set foot on this particular stretch of ground. What there is a perimeter that extends far beyond the postcard version of Windsor Castle, reaching into service roads and maintenance corridors and stretches of wall that have no name on any tourist map. What there is a hand-picked rotation of guardsmen who are selected not because they are the most visible representatives of British military tradition, but because they are the most capable of functioning without any of the structures that daytime duty provides. No crowd to establish position, no daylight to read the ground, no ceremony to anchor the rhythm of the shift. Just the dark, the cold, the castle, and the men responsible for it. For over 500 years, something has stood between the British royal family and anyone who wished them harm. Most of that history has been photographed, painted, and written about at considerable length. But there is a chapter of that history that takes place every single night and leaves no public record whatsoever. The men who walk it prefer it that way. This is the story of one night on the patrol that the tourists never see. And before it is over, a group of young urban explorers are going to discover something that their cameras were absolutely not prepared for. You do not get assigned to night patrol at Windsor Castle because someone has run out of places to put you. You get assigned to night patrol because a senior officer has watched you for a considerable period of time and concluded that you are the specific kind of person who does not need to be watched yourself. That distinction matters more than it might initially sound. The daytime rotation at Windsor is one of the most scrutinized postings in the entire British Army. Every move a guardsman makes in front of the public is observed, assessed, discussed, and filmed by approximately 10,000 people on any given day. The pressure is visible and constant, and in a strange way it is also supportive, because the crowd creates a kind of structure. You know where you are supposed to stand because the rope line tells you. You know when to march because the clock tells you. You know your route because you have walked it in daylight so many times that your feet would find it in a blackout. The night patrol strips all of that away. A night patrol guardsman at Windsor is responsible for a significantly larger section of ground than his daytime counterpart, covering not just the ceremonial front face of the castle, but the full eastern perimeter, the service entrance on the north side, the stretch of the home park that borders the public footpath, and 3 separate access points that most members of the public do not know exist. He walks this route in darkness, in silence, and with a level of environmental awareness that takes the better part of 2 years to fully develop. He is not there to be seen. He is there to see. The men who do this work fall into a particular type, and the veterans will tell you that you can identify them within about 40 seconds of meeting them. They are not the loudest people in the room. They do not particularly feel the need to explain themselves. They have a quality of stillness about them even when they are in motion, as if the part of their brain that most people use for social performance has been quietly reassigned to more practical work. They notice things. They notice them without reacting to them. And when the time comes to act on what they have noticed, they do so with an economy of movement that looks almost casual until you understand exactly what has just happened. There are 12 men on the full night rotation on any given evening. On the night that concerns us here, the patrol was led by Sergeant Marcus Webb, 41 years old, 22 years of service, a man who had done 3 tours in places that required a security clearance to name, and had come back from all of them with the same expression he had left with. Under him were 11 guardsmen ranging in experience from 9 years down to 7 months. The most junior of them was a 19-year-old from Shropshire named Daniel Hartley, who had been on night patrol for exactly 3 weeks, and who would, before this particular shift was over, conduct himself in a manner that Sergeant Webb would reference in training briefings for the next 4 years. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The patrol briefing on this night took place at 21:45 in a room that tourists have never entered and will never enter, because it contains the kind of operational detail about Windsor Castle's security that the institution has spent 5 centuries keeping very close to its chest. The briefing was 11 minutes long. The men then moved to their start positions without discussion, without ceremony, and without any of the visible preparation that television dramas associate with serious military operations. They simply stood up and went to work. Outside, the night was cold, clear, and very quiet. It would not stay quiet. They called themselves a crew, which is the kind of word that sounds considerably more dangerous than the reality it describes in this particular context. There were 5 of them. Their names were Jake, Priya, Connor, Saoirse, and a young man who went by the name Torch because he owned an expensive headlamp and had mentioned this fact often enough that it had become his defining characteristic. They were aged between 19 and 23. They had a combined following on social media of approximately 40,000 people, most of whom followed them because they posted videos of themselves getting into places they were not supposed to be, and most of whom would have been genuinely surprised to learn that the consequences of those visits were typically far less dramatic than the editing suggested. Jake had researched Windsor Castle for 3 weeks. He had studied satellite images. He had walked the public perimeter twice in daylight on separate occasions, on the second visit with a notepad. He had identified what he believed was a weakness in the eastern boundary wall, where a section of older stonework created a series of footholds that a reasonably fit person could use to get over the top. He had timed the interval between what he thought were the patrol intervals, based on watching a guardsman through a gap in the tree line from the public footpath on a Tuesday afternoon. He had made a number of errors in this research. The first error was the assumption that what he observed of the daytime patrol bore any meaningful relationship to the night patrol's timing and routing. It does not. The night rotation runs on a deliberately irregular schedule, because a predictable patrol is a patrol that can be planned around, and the men responsible for designing the night schedule at Windsor had been thinking about that particular problem for considerably longer than Jake had been alive. The second error was the belief that getting over the wall was the beginning of the challenge. In fact, for the night patrol, it is the notification. At 23:17 on this particular evening, a sensor that Jake had not identified and could not have identified from any public position registered a pressure change consistent with a person climbing the eastern boundary wall. This information appeared on a screen in a monitoring room. The man watching that screen noted it, cross-referenced it with the camera coverage for that section, confirmed what he was seeing, and communicated a single brief instruction to Sergeant Marcus Webb, who was at that moment approximately 200 meters away, standing in the shadow of a tree on the edge of the home park with the specific quality of stillness that 22 years of this kind of work produces. Webb listened to the instruction through his earpiece. He did not increase his pace. He did not change his posture. He simply turned by perhaps 15 degrees and began walking in a slightly different direction. And behind him, without any visible signal passing between them, 3 other guardsmen adjusted their positions in a pattern that, seen from above, would have looked very much like a hand slowly closing. On the other side of the wall, Jake dropped to the ground, crouched, looked around, and whispered back to the others that it looked clear. It was not clear. It had not been clear for approximately 45 seconds before he landed. Here is what urban explorers consistently fail to understand about genuinely secure locations. And it is a failure that is very difficult to correct, because the experience of being inside a place you are not supposed to be creates a powerful feeling of competence and control that overrides a significant amount of rational assessment. The feeling of not being caught is not the same as the reality of not being caught. Jake moved first, staying low, heading toward the inner wall of the service corridor that he had identified on the satellite image as a potential route toward the secondary courtyard. Behind him, Connor helped Priya over the wall, then Saoirse, then Torch, whose expensive headlamp was switched firmly off because even Jake had understood that turning a headlamp on in the grounds of Windsor Castle at 11:30 at night was not a strategy likely to produce desirable outcomes. They moved in single file. Jake set the pace. Nobody spoke beyond the occasional urgent hand signal that Connor had seen in a military film and taught to the others, which were not the actual military hand signals they were intended to replicate, but which served the group's purposes adequately in the sense that everyone understood stop, come forward, and I think I heard something. They covered perhaps 60 meters. They were, at this point, being observed by 4 separate cameras, one of which was specifically angled to cover the route Jake had chosen based on his satellite research, because that particular route had been identified by the security team as a natural line of approach and had been planned around accordingly. They were also within visual range of 2 guardsmen, neither of whom they could see, because both guardsmen were standing in positions that a casual observer would not identify as surveillance positions, which is the entire point of the training that qualifies a person for night patrol in the first place. Sergeant Webb was not concerned. This was not because the situation was not serious. Any unauthorized entry to the castle grounds is serious, full stop, and is treated accordingly. But because the situation was entirely within the parameters of what the night patrol is designed to handle, and because the 5 young people currently crouching their way along the Eastern Service Corridor were displaying every behavioral characteristic of people who believed they were conducting a covert operation, rather than people who were actually conducting one. They were moving too fast for genuine stealth. They were clustering, which meant that when the containment happened, it would happen to all of them in the same moment, rather than requiring sequential management. And they were, critically, following the route that the satellite image suggested rather than the route that actual knowledge of the ground would suggest, which meant that in approximately 40 more meters they were going to walk into a dead end, created by a section of the maintenance compound that did not appear on any publicly available image, because it had been constructed after those images were taken. Webb gave a quiet instruction through the communication system. 2 guardsmen who had been parallel to the group's route, invisible in the shadows along the wall, simply stopped moving and waited. The group reached the dead end. Jake put his hand up. The column stopped. He stared at the wall in front of him for a moment. Then he turned and pointed back the way they had come, indicating they needed to find another route. What he did not know was that the route they had come from was no longer the route they had come from, in the sense that it was now occupied by people who had not been there before. The group turned around. Torch, who was at the back of the column and therefore now at the front, walked 4 steps and then stopped walking very suddenly, in the manner of someone who has just seen something that their brain is taking a moment to fully process. Standing in the corridor, completely still, completely silent, in the particular quality of darkness that the amber perimeter lights do not quite reach, were two members of the night patrol. They had not moved toward the group. They had not called out. They had simply arrived at a position that the group was now walking into, and they were standing there with the specific stillness that the night patrol produces in a man after sufficient years of practice. And they were waiting, and there was absolutely nothing theatrical or performative about it whatsoever, which somehow made it considerably more effective than theater would have been. Torch said a word that this account will not reproduce. The column stopped. Rewind by approximately 4 minutes, to the moment when the group was still moving along the Eastern Service corridor in confident single file, and pay attention to the second person from the back. Saoirse was 20 years old. She had been on 2 previous urban exploration visits with Jake and Connor, both of which had involved abandoned buildings rather than active security installations, and both of which had concluded without incident largely because the locations in question were genuinely unguarded. She was not, if she was being honest with herself, entirely certain why she had agreed to this particular visit, because Windsor Castle was a different category of proposition from a disused textile factory in Leicester, and she had known that going in. She had come partly because she did not want to be the one who said she wasn't coming, and partly because Jake had been very confident about his research, and partly because 20 years old is an age at which the gap between what you know to be true and what you are willing to act on is at its widest and most consequential. Somewhere around the 40-meter mark, Saoirse's foot came down on a loose stone that shifted sideways under her weight and sent her stumbling sideways into the wall with a sound that was not loud by any objective measure, but was extremely loud relative to the silence that the group had been carefully maintaining. She caught herself. Jake turned and looked at her. She gave him the hand signal for fine, I'm fine, keep going, and he turned back and kept going, and the group moved on. Saoirse did not move on. What happened in the moment of that stumble, with the cold stone wall hard against her shoulder and the absolute darkness of the Windsor Castle grounds pressing in from every direction, was that the gap between what she knew and what she was doing closed very suddenly and completely. And what she was left with was a 20-year-old woman standing alone in the grounds of Windsor Castle at 11:30 at night, with no clear idea of where the exit was, no particular confidence in her ability to find it, and the very strong and entirely accurate feeling that she was not as alone as the darkness suggested. She did not call out to the group. She pressed herself against the wall and stayed very still. 12 meters away, also very still, also pressed against the wall but on the opposite side of the corridor, was Daniel Hartley, 19 years old, 3 weeks into his first night patrol rotation, from a small town in Shropshire where the loudest thing that happened on a Tuesday night was the pub quiz at the Crown and Anchor. Daniel had been tracking the group since the censor notification, assigned by Sergeant Webb to maintain observation on the rear of the column, precisely because the rear of a column is where individuals tend to separate when things go sideways, and Webb had been doing this long enough to know that things going sideways was not an unlikely outcome. When Saoirse stumbled and the group moved on without her, Daniel registered this development with the part of his brain that 3 weeks of night patrol training had already begun to rewire for exactly this purpose. And he stood where he was for a moment and assessed what he was looking at. He was looking at a young woman who was frightened, alone, cold, and not a threat to anything except her own future evening plans. He stepped out of the shadow. He did not shout. He did not raise his weapon. He did not use any of the command language that the situation would have technically permitted him to use, because he looked at Saoirse for approximately 1.5 seconds and concluded that command language was not what this moment required. He said, quietly and conversationally, as if he had perhaps encountered her at a bus stop, rather than in the secured perimeter of a royal residence at 11:30 at night. You've lost your group. It was not a question. Saoirse stared at him. She was, by her own later account, expecting to be shouted at. She was expecting at minimum the kind of loud, authoritative language that the daytime guards deploy when a tourist steps too close to the fence. She was not expecting a 19-year-old from Shropshire to state the obvious in the tone of someone making an observation about the weather. She said, "Yes." Daniel nodded. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said she wasn't. He said, "All right, stay where you are for a moment." And then he was still again, and he spoke quietly into his communication system. And in the monitoring room, a man watching a screen noted the development and passed it to Sergeant Webb. And Sergeant Webb, who was at that moment approximately 30 meters from the dead end, where the rest of the group had just made their discovery, allowed something that was not quite a smile to pass across his face before resuming his previous expression. On the CCTV footage, which several people would review in some detail over the following days, Daniel Hartley stands in that corridor with Saoirse for 4 minutes and 30 seconds while the rest of the situation is resolved. He does not move toward her. He does not move away. He simply stands at a respectful distance, visible and still, and at one point says something that makes her let out a breath that is almost a laugh. And the sound carries in the cold, quiet air of the castle grounds in a way that nobody watching the footage can quite explain. Nobody who watched that footage ever asked what he said. Somehow it didn't seem like the point. Back in the dead-end corridor, the situation was resolving with the kind of quiet efficiency that the night patrol is specifically designed to produce. And that is significantly more unsettling to experience than anything louder would have been. Jake, Connor, Priya, and Torch were standing in a rough cluster, and in front of them and behind them, and to their left, where a gap in the wall that they had not previously noticed turned out to contain a guardsman who had presumably been there for some time, were members of the night patrol. Nobody had shouted. Nobody had run. Nobody had done anything that would have translated into compelling footage for a social media channel, which was in its own way the most disorienting aspect of the entire encounter. This is the thing about the night patrol that the daytime coverage of the King's Guard does not prepare you for. The daytime guards are loud when they need to be loud. The command voice is a tool, and they deploy it clearly and without hesitation when a tourist steps into the marching path, or gets too close to the fence or tries to touch the bearskin cap. The loudness is part of the function because the daytime environment is loud, and because the crowd requires clear signals, and because the ceremony has its own rhythms and the verbal command is part of maintaining those rhythms. The night patrol does not work in a loud environment. The night patrol works in silence, and silence is a tool as well. And on this particular evening in the Eastern Service Corridor of Windsor Castle, it was being deployed with considerable precision. Sergeant Marcus Webb stepped forward from the group of guardsmen and looked at the 4 young people in front of him for a moment without saying anything, in the way that a person who is completely in control of a situation and knows it can afford to do. Then he said, "Phones. Not give me your phones. Not I need you to hand over your phones. Not a lengthy explanation of the legal basis for the request or the consequences of noncompliance. Just the single word, delivered in a tone that established beyond any reasonable ambiguity that this was not the opening position in a negotiation." Jake handed his phone over. Connor handed his over. Priya, who was a more experienced decision-maker than either of them in the relevant sense, had hers out before Webb finished saying the word. Torch, after a moment of what appeared to be internal deliberation, also handed his over, and as he did so he became aware that his expensive headlamp, the accessory that had defined his social identity within this particular group of people, had at some point in the preceding minutes been not so much switched off as become entirely irrelevant, which seemed to him to contain some kind of message about the evening that he would need more time to process. Webb took the phones. He did not look at them. He passed them to the guardsman on his left. Then he said, "Is anyone injured?" They said no. He said, "Is there anyone else in your group?" Jake, whose research had not extended to a theory of what to do when the research turned out to have significant gaps, looked at Connor. Connor looked at the ground. Priya said, "One more. She's back there. She didn't do anything." Webb looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man to whom the concept of someone not doing anything in a situation where everyone present had climbed the same wall at the same time required some quiet consideration. Then he spoke into his communication system, and a few seconds later the reply came back. And whatever Daniel Hartley said on the other end of that communication, it was brief and clear, and Webb nodded once. He looked back at the group. "She's fine," he said. "She'll be brought up to you shortly." Priya let out a breath. Jake opened his mouth, possibly to say something about the research, or the wall, or the satellite images, or the Tuesday afternoon observation from the public footpath. He then closed it again, which was the best decision he made all evening. They waited. The guardsmen waited with them. The silence was absolute and comfortable and entirely one-sided. Let's step back for a moment, because what just happened in that corridor deserves some context, and the context goes back considerably further than this particular evening. The practice of mounting a night guard at Windsor Castle predates the current version of the building. It predates several versions of the building. It predates, in some form, the concept of the building as it currently exists, because the requirement to protect the place where the monarch sleeps does not take the night off, and has not taken the night off in any century since the first stone was laid on the hill above the Thames, and someone put a man with a weapon at the door and told him to stand there until morning. What that requirement has become, after 5 centuries of refinement and hard-won operational knowledge, is the night patrol as it currently operates. And the current operation is built on a set of principles that the daytime ceremony, for all its visible impressiveness, does not fully display. The first principle is that the night patrol sees without being seen. This is not a metaphor. The positioning of guardsmen on the night rotation is calibrated to maximize observation coverage while minimizing the visible signature of the patrol itself. The gaps between positions are not gaps at all in the sense that a trespasser would understand them to be. They are corridors of observation, lanes of coverage, maintained by men who have spent enough time on this ground in darkness to know which shadows are reliable and which ones shift with the wind and the cloud cover. The second principle is that the night patrol responds without escalating. This sounds simple, and is in practice one of the most demanding skills the training produces, because the instinct under stress is to match the energy of the situation you are managing. A panicked trespasser produces an instinct to project authority loudly and physically. A calm night patrol guardsman projects authority differently, through presence, through positioning, through the quality of stillness that tells a person's nervous system, at a level below conscious thought, that the person in front of them is entirely comfortable with how this situation is going to end. The third principle, and the one that the events of this evening illustrated most clearly, is that the night patrol is responsible for everyone inside the perimeter, including the people who are not supposed to be there. When Saoirse stumbled and separated from the group, she became the responsibility of the nearest night patrol guardsman the moment she became isolated. Not a threat to be managed, not a complication to be resolved. A person who was alone and frightened in a place she should not be, and whose safety was now, by the logic of the patrol's mandate, something that a 19-year-old guardsman from Shropshire was accountable for. Daniel Hartley understood this without being told, which is why Sergeant Webb had assigned him to the rear of the column observation in the first place, and why the footage of those 4 minutes and 30 seconds in the corridor would be watched by senior figures who did not typically spend their time reviewing CCTV from the Eastern Service corridor. The bearskin cap, the polished boots, the rigid posture in the midday sun, these things are real, and they represent something real about the institution they belong to. But they are the visible surface of something that runs considerably deeper, and the depth is most clearly visible precisely where the ceremony stops, which is at nightfall, at the point where the tourists go home, and the lights dim, and the long walk empties out, and the men responsible for what happens in the dark take their positions and begin the work that leaves no public record. The urban explorers in the Eastern Service Corridor, standing in the quiet company of several guardsmen who were clearly not interested in being dramatic about any of this, were getting a lesson in that depth without fully having the vocabulary to describe what they were experiencing. What they were experiencing was competence, not performed competence, actual competence. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it has already demonstrated itself by the time you realize it is present. Torch, to his credit, would later say in a video that received more views than any of his exploration content, "We thought we were going in there to find something to film. It turned out the thing to film was us being completely outclassed by people who were absolutely unbothered about it." He said it with something approaching admiration, which was probably the correct response. The 5 young people were escorted to the main gatehouse and handed to the police, who were expecting them, which was itself a detail that Jake found particularly deflating given the 3 weeks of preparation. Their phones were returned after the footage was reviewed and deleted. Nobody was charged with anything that would follow them in the way they had briefly feared. They were processed and released into the cold Windsor night, with the particular feeling of people who have been shown a version of the world they had not previously known was there. Priya, walking back toward the car, said to no one in particular, "That guard who found me, he was younger than me." "He was younger than me too," said Saoirse. They were quiet for a moment. "He didn't shout," said Saoirse. "No," said Priya. They did not say anything else about it, but they did not need to, because the thing that Saoirse was describing had already settled into the part of memory where significant experiences go, and it would stay there for a considerable time. Inside the castle perimeter, Sergeant Marcus Webb completed a brief post-incident report that contained fewer words than most people use to describe a minor inconvenience and submitted it through the appropriate channel. He then returned to his route, because the incident was over and the shift was not, and the shift does not end because something interesting happened during it. At 00:23, in the sector of the eastern perimeter that the incident had been cleared from, a single guardsman was walking his route in the darkness. He was walking it in silence. He was walking it in the cold that comes off the Thames in the early hours and settles into the low ground around the castle with a persistence that a person who has not experienced it cannot quite imagine from description. He was walking it alone, which is to say he was walking it without anyone to observe him, without any audience for whom his posture or his precision or his pace might mean anything. He was walking it the same way he would have walked it at noon, with 1,000 cameras on him. Because that is the thing about discipline, the real thing, the thing that the daytime photographs gesture toward but cannot fully show. It is not a performance that is switched on for observers and switched off when they leave. If it can be switched off, it is not discipline. It is theater. Theater serves a real purpose and should not be dismissed. But it is not the same thing as the quality that keeps a 19-year-old from Shropshire walking a precise and demanding route through the Windsor Castle grounds at 23 minutes past midnight in the dark and the cold with no one watching. No one watching, that is, except the camera at the end of the Eastern Service Corridor, which caught Daniel Hartley at exactly that moment, passing through the pool of amber light at the corner, and showed him briefly and clearly before the darkness took him again, continuing his route, completely alone, completely composed, counting his steps toward the next position. He did not know the camera was there. Or perhaps he did know, and it made no difference to him. Which is, in the end, exactly the point. Discipline is not what you do when someone is watching. It is what you do when the lights go out, the tourists go home, and the only record of who you are is the ground you covered and the people you were responsible for. The King's Guard walks that ground every single night. Most of the world sleeps right through it.